What does the Bible say about these regular people? I've got a few of them I want to outline for you this morning. And I'm going to do it chronologically. We've got Moses, Gideon, David, Jeremiah, and Paul. There will be more to come in the coming weeks as we dig into some of their characters and their faults and failures and look at the reality of who these men and women really were. And the reason why we want to highlight it is because we anchor everything that we do back to what the truth of the Bible is. And this is the cool part. The Bible sets the precedent for what we can expect in our faith journeys. The Bible sets the precedent for what we can expect in our faith journeys. If you're not finding it in the Bible, toss it out no matter how great it might seem, ignore it. But the Bible, in its entirety, sets the precedent for what we can expect in our faith journeys with God. And this is so cool. The Bible is full of wildly ill-equipped men and women who simply said yes. They were regular, like you and like me, and God used them. Moses, he lived from 1525 to 1406 BC. He was a murderer. Probably not too many murderers here, but there may be. It's oddly silent in this middle section. Concern for all of you here. Everybody's looking at their neighbor. Who's sitting next to me? He was a murderer. He was a coward. He was a terrible speaker, likely had a significant speech impediment. Significant speech impediment. I don't know who invented the word speech impediment, but saying speech impediment, if you have a speech impediment, is probably quite a difficult task. Yeah, that's right. Murderers seem to be a common occurrence with biblical characters. It seems bizarre that that would be the case. We think of some of the worst things that could be committed, and murder is definitely up there on the list. How could God use a murderer? If God can use a murderer, guess what? He can use you. Stay regular. Stay regular. David was a murderer. Moses was a murderer. The list goes on and on. We'll touch on David here in a minute. He ran for his life after murdering an Egyptian. He ran away and became a shepherd out in the bush well, it wasn't the bush, it was the desert. But for 40 years, he became a shepherd in the wilderness, in the desert regions. Wasn't a good speaker. And he literally says this, he goes, "My Lord, I'm not eloquent. Either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, I'm just slow of speech and of tongue." And God says this to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord, that does these things? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." So Moses goes back to Egypt, a former murderer, probably in exile in the land, might have had to shave his beard so nobody could recognize him. Stops murdering, stops shepherding, goes in to free the entire people of Israel and bring them out of Egypt, and he was just a regular man. A nation was transformed by God using a regular man. Gideon, he lived around 1169 BC. He was the least of his family. He says this with his own mouth. He was the least of his family. Anybody here feel like they're probably just the least of their entire family? And not only was he the least of his family, he was the least of his entire people group. His whole people group. He was nervous. He was second-guessing continuously, putting out fleeces. "Lord, make this sheepskin wet if you want me to do your will." I don't know if I trust him. Flip it over. "Lord, make this sheepskin dry if you want me to do your will." I'm not sure how I feel about this. He just goes on and on. He was second-guessing. He was unsure. But ultimately, he was willing. God didn't seek some already powerful, domineering, amazing, fit, muscle-bound character of a guy to go and do this incredible work with a wonderful TED Talk opening speech to get people on his side. God called Gideon, who is the least of his family, the least of his entire people group, who was nervous and unsure and wasn't able to even give a persuasive speech. God took him and used him so that God would be glorified by anything good that came out of Gideon's life. Gideon had a whole crew of people that he was going to take into war. And God dwindled that whole group of people down to just 300 men who were willing to say yes. Gideon didn't even have men on his side to go and do an enormous task. There were 130,000 people, warriors, that Gideon had to go and fight against for the protection of this land, and he only had 300 people. The odds were not ever in his favor. It was not a good situation. Yet God used a man who was the least of his family, the least of his people, had the smallest army, didn't have the skill sets, and in that, an army of 135,000 people, battle-tested warriors and soldiers, were put down because Gideon was obedient, and God brought the victory. And because God brought the victory, God got the glory. Turn to your neighbor and say, I'm regular. David, I love David. I could read about David's life all the time. Why? Because David is the king of regular. Absolutely. Now, if you're bored, go read some Psalms, learn about David, hear his heart's cry before God. This regular guy, he was the most regular of all regular. He was young. He was literally hanging out with sheep and playing his guitar all day long. He basically was from Pass Creek. David was from Pass Creek. David off, and he lived up in Pass Creek. The Dukes get that. That's good. And he lived up in, and all he had, he's just strumming away, and he's just hanging out with the sheep, and he's tending to the things that are in front of him and just doing hippie things up in Pass Creek. He is just a young guy who turned into an adulterer, who turned into a murderer, and God used him. And we think God can't use our circumstances in our life. God used this sheep herder, guitar-playing hippie who is an adulterer and a murderer to further God's kingdom. And we think God can't touch our circumstances? My goodness. David, I love this. David was called a man after God's own heart. And we see that outlined in Acts, okay? A man after God's own heart. Why was he a man after God's own heart? We think that's an endearing term that God placed upon David. David was a man after my own heart. David was a man after God's own heart because David was after God's heart. David sinned big and repented bigger. David knew what it meant to be humble before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. David saw the wretched state of his circumstances, and he fell on his knees before his Creator and said, Lord, forgive me. My sin is ever before me, it says in Psalm 51. I deserve death. I deserve everything you have to give me. Lord, I need you. Don't take your Holy Spirit from me, please, Lord. If sacrifice got me closer to you, I'd give more sacrifice. If singing these songs made me in a better standing before you, I'd sing all of them. That's not what you want. You want a broken and contrite heart. God wants a broken heart. He doesn't care about your qualifications. He doesn't care about your education. He doesn't care about the background you come from or the things that you have done. All he wants from you is your heart, and say, yes, Lord, send me. I am willing. I give my heart to you. Next to me in the desk, Rebecca McLean. Dr. Rebecca McLean now. Nobody expected it, not one. She's sitting next to me in class, and our teacher, Mr. Szymanski, is writing up on the board, the chalkboard, and he's writing away notes on the chalkboard. And And he did this funny thing. He wrote with this hand, but this hand also mimicked what the other hand was doing. And we laughed and we snickered. We try not to laugh at him too much, but we couldn't help ourselves at times. And he's writing away on the chalkboard and his hands fidgeting behind him. And he says, it's a pop quiz today, kids. Grade 7, in our angst. Rebecca McLean pipes up. That's not fair, Mr. Smansky. You can't give us a pop quiz. We're not ready for a pop quiz. And she was so perturbed by this. And clearly, Mr. Szymanski was having a rough day because he threw that chalk across the room and he grabbed his meter stick, back in the day it was called a yardstick, and he slapped it on the desk and he goes, you want fair? I'll tell you what fair is. If you want fair, you'd all be burning in hell. That's what he said to us in grade 7. Never forgotten that. Never forgotten it. If you want fair, you'd all be burning in hell. And his voice was squeaking, and the ruler cracked, and Rebecca cried and ran away, and it was the most important lesson I ever had in my entire life. Thank the Lord that he doesn't deal with us according to our messes, because we know what we deserve. We're deserving of nothing good, let me promise you that this morning. David declares to the Lord, he goes, Lord, have mercy on me according to your steadfast love. He declares God's promises back to the Lord. Lord, have mercy on me according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Lord, please blot out my sins and my transgressions. Wash me from my iniquities. Cleanse me from my sins. David went from being a lowly shepherd, hippie-dwelling, Pass Creek-loving, guitar-playing shepherd, and he was transformed into one of the greatest kings next to Christ that we've ever seen in the history of the world, and he was just a regular guy. Turn to your neighbor and say, I'm regular. I am a regular. God uses the regular things. Folks, you and me, we are regular people that God has got a purpose and a plan for. All we got to do is say, yes, Lord, send me. Yes, Lord, send me. Jeremiah, 627 to 586 BC. Another young guy. This guy lived in the final days of a once great nation called Judah, and it was crumbling to its death before Jeremiah's eyes. Nobody, literally not a soul, listened to Jeremiah. You think that you got something special to say and that you want your voice to be heard? Nobody listened to Jeremiah, and God literally told him, you need to go and say these things and no one's going to listen to you. And he still did it in obedience. He was rejected, not only rejected by his kinsmen, by his people around him, not only rejected by his nation, but he was also rejected by his family. He had nothing left. He was full of sorrow. They called him the weeping prophet. This doesn't sound too exciting. Called him the weeping prophet. Nothing that God gave him to say was nice. In fact, it was horrendously painful. But still in the midst of this regular man said yes to God. God called him and said, I'm calling you, Jeremiah, to be my messenger, and no one is going to listen to a thing that you say. Imagine being called by God to go into a missions field where you knew already that you were going to be completely rejected and it was going to be a nightmare. You couldn't write a nice letter back to your church who's supporting you in missions work saying, we did this, this, and this today. Thank you. Let's raise some more funds. Nothing. Jeremiah had nothing. He didn't have anything good to capitalize on here. Imagine being out on the missions field and being rejected by your family, your friends, your entire country. He wasn't even allowed to marry. He had nobody except for the Lord in his life. He was utterly alone and only had God to comfort him. When he was being called by God, he says to God, I'm so young, Lord. I'm just so young. Young people, listen to this. Jeremiah had his heart tapped into by God, and he's realizing the immediacy of the task that's in front of him and how huge it is. And by rights, he has every reason to run the other direction because he is not stepping into a life of comfort. And he says to the Lord, Lord, I'm so young. And God says to him, don't say I'm only a youth. For to all whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Don't be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. He was young, nervous, ill-equipped. Naturally, he could not do a thing that was set before him in his own strength. It's true. Man, some of us have a hard time just going to Safeway. It's too daunting of a task to just leave our houses. Imagine knowing beforehand you're going to go to Safeway and then people in Safeway are going to kill you. Seriously. This is what Jeremiah was walking into. Yet God sustained him. God ministered to him. Jeremiah wasn't his own strength. God was his strength in the midst of a hellish circumstance. He did not possess what it took. What Jeremiah had to do was greater than the strength that any person could ever possess. So Jeremiah wrote this in his letters, and he says this, the Lord put out his hand and he touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, behold, Jeremiah, I have put my words in your mouth. When I am weak, he is strong. When you are weak, he is strong. When you are weak and anything good comes from your life, God gets the glory and no other person does. And Jeremiah was the last prophet to be used by God in the southern kingdom of Judah before it fell to the Assyrians. He was obedient to whatever it is that God asked him to do. Finally, as we tip into the New Testament, we see Paul. Paul lived from about 7 AD to 67 AD. And you think with the burgeoning church and Christ coming on the scene that God would choose somebody who was at least an A+ Christian and just loved the church? Paul approved of Stephen's death by stoning. Stephen was one of the early church disciples, and he was murdered brutally in public by the death of stoning in the streets as people gathered around him and bludgeoned him to death with every rock and brick that they could find. Paul gave that the thumbs up. He was called Saul at that point. He was perhaps single-handedly one of the greatest persecutors of the early church. His original name, Saul, literally meant destroyer. He was the great prosecutor of the church, but he also became the church's greatest missionary. Before his conversion, he saw many of the early church members killed under his orders and commands. He was breathing murderous threats against the disciples of the Lord. Anyone who is found belonging to the way or being a part of the followers of Christ, men and women, they were told to be bound and brought into Jerusalem for punishment and death. But God got a hold of this man's heart. You talk about a testimony. We wonder, can God possibly use our circumstances? I know what I've thought. And I know what I've felt. I know what I have done in my actions. I know what I have done in my mind. How could I possibly be used by God to do anything good whatsoever? But God appeared to this man, called him by name, reached out beyond time and space, and got a hold of his heart. And he said, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And later, Saul's name was changed to Paul. He went from being the destroyer, his name was transformed to small and humble. That's what Paul means. It wasn't by his own strength that anything good came from his life. He had not a single thing good to show for it, but God used him and God transformed him. Paul no longer destroyed the church, but rather through humility and exalting the Lord, he watched the church grow.